At some point, the Soviet Union fell and many of the post-Soviet republics ended up in some sort of an autocracy. But the details vary quite a lot, from the smiley-faced autocracy of Kazakhstan until last year, to warmongering autocracy of Belarus, and to the closed system of Turkmenistan, which we will discuss later on in this series. The events in the post-Soviet era did not play out uniformly. In Uzbekistan, following tensions with Moscow, the politburo appointed Islam Abduganyevich Karimov to be the ruler, a lesser-known, non-elite party apparatchik from Samarqand who was also a practicing Muslim, a taboo for most of the existence of the Soviet Union. The Union itself didn't survive enough to at least get an idea on how's the guy they just appointed like. Islom Karimov would turn out to be a collection of paradoxes. The devout Muslim that enacted some of the harshest restrictions on Muslim life in known history, the devout Muslim who would ally with George W. Bush to hunt down Islamists in Afghanistan, a cheerleader in international setting for drone strikes, but at the same time far from a friend of the West or Russia. All while relentlessly attempting and ultimately failing to recreate the Uzbek society in his image through a complex system of checkpoints, gigantic security apparatus with the SGB secret police as the crown jewel, and through statues and pictures of himself everywhere. Oh, and through cotton-picking slavery. The rule of Islom Karimov over Uzbekistan is one of the rarer discussed stories of contemporary dictatorships. So in this episode, we'll try to at least get an idea on one of the most paradoxical autocracies of the post-Soviet space. What was like to live under Islom Karimov? Why did he enact restrictions on Muslim life? Why did he boil people alive? Who opposed him and why? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the 7th featured installment of the Central Asia featured series. In the last episode, we left the story of Uzbekistan at the end of the Soviet-Afghan War and the appointment by Gorbachev of Islam Karimov as the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Uzbek SSR. Officially, he was appointed after his predecessor failed to quell interethnic clashes and instability in the Fergana region. In reality, however, the reason was simpler. Moscow wanted to tone down the political mess brought by the Afghan war, the purges, the corruption scandals, and Islam Karimov from Samarkand was just a good choice. He hadn't been involved in the purges, was not a member of the local party elite, and was known as a good Muslim. This was on the backdrop of the Communist Party gradually losing legitimacy throughout the 1980s, especially because of the Soviet-Afghan War. During that war, both the MI6 and the CIA spread radical anti-Soviet Islamic propaganda, particularly in SSR Uzbekistan, under the calculus that the Uzbeks would have very legitimate reasons to be upset with Moscow and thus primed for grievance. The calculation proved correct. The messaging that Moscow is sending Muslim boys to fight fellow Muslims in Afghanistan for no reason landed home with many Uzbeks and other peoples of Central Asia and was, arguably, an intelligence success that shortened the slaughter. However, this also came with some troubles. Pro-Russians will blame most of the troubles I'm about to describe on the CIA, but that would ascribe to Western intelligence a level of foresight that would have been humanly impossible. One has to be reminded that in 1988 almost nobody expected the USSR to cease to exist anytime soon. But it did. And once that happened, the newly created anti-Soviet Islamic sentiment generated Islamic movements in all countries of Central Asia. As I was explaining in episodes 2 and 4, this led to all-out civil war in Tajikistan, while in Kazakhstan it led to relatively moderate systemic political parties that were more or less content with a religiously tolerant secular autocracy. But Islom Karimov did not and could not know how things would play out in Uzbekistan at the time. This footage is a clip that Islom Karimov fought for 25 years to make it go away. It never did, and towards the end of his rule it was tacitly accepted as part of history. What you're looking at is a video of Tahir Yuldashev browbeating Islom Karimov before a massive crowd of supporters. The clip is shot in December 1991 in the city Namangan, located in the Uzbek side of the Fergana Valley in the country's far east. As I mentioned several times already in this series, the Fergana Valley is a source of troubles and a point of contention for the three countries that share it: Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. It's a classic post-colonial story: borders drawn up by a colonial power, Russia in this case, without any regard for the ethnic and cultural realities on the ground. Well, following the fall of the USSR, the Fergana Valley became a powder keg. On the Uzbek side, the city of Namangan was the center of radical Islamic resurgence. Or, if you believe the current narrative, the Islamic resurgence climbed on pre-existent local grievances. Either way, the violence began even before the USSR got dissolved. As I was saying in the previous episode, Uzbekistan is still in the process of writing its own story. But regardless of whose analysis you accept, the fact remains that the late 1980s and the years 1990 and 1991 saw a sharp rise in religiosity, a sharp decline in standard of living in Uzbekistan, and the Soviet apparatus unable to understand either of the phenomena while continuing to work as if it was all business as usual. On this backdrop, 5 off-duty Soviet Interior Ministry troops were killed at the hands of a mob in the center of the city in December 1990. According to an account published by the Soviet newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda, headlined Namangan's Rotten Apples, the killings were a reprisal for the soldiers' alleged and imagined, as the newspaper had it, manhandling of a local woman. News reports at the time said that 4 soldiers were trapped inside a bus and burned alive. A 5th was severely beaten and succumbed to his injuries the following day. Local officials said the mob was composed mainly of boys in their late teens. Throughout 1991, such violence continued to the point where no secular authority had been left in the city de facto. As the USSR formally disappeared in 1991, the time had come for the first round of quasi-free elections in post-communism. This footage is basically from that election campaign. The 1991 election, as unfree and unfair as it was still the fairest election held in Uzbekistan because it was also the only one where the incumbent had a real challenger in the person of this man, Muhammad Salih, an avant-garde poet of great intellectual and philosophical capacity, but with limited understanding of hard power. He had translated the prose of Franz Kafka and French poets of the 20th century into Uzbek. Also, his poems were translated into many languages. He had founded the National Conservative Freedom Party in 1989 and was, and still is, though no longer in the country, a highly articulate and politically knowledgeable man. Other opposition figures, such as Abdurrahim Pulatov from the Unity Party and Abdullah Kutayev, leader of the Islamic Renaissance Party of Uzbekistan, were simply kept out from the ballot via standard Komi shenanigans, changing of the rules overnight, requiring an undue amount of signatures in a short amount of time, and so on and so forth. Officially, the 1991 presidential election was won by Karimov with 87% of the vote. In reality, Karimov did win, but more like with 67% of the vote. Straight-up stealing or backyard burning of ballots was widespread, but even so, the poet did concede that he lost. However, this was also possible because Mr. Salih was given just 15 minutes of airtime throughout the campaign. The rest of the 99% of airtime was awarded to Islam Karimov. In a world without internet and freshly out of the Soviet Union, this mattered quite a lot. But the reason I'm showing you a lot of this 1991 footage in Namangan is because Islam Karimov did not focus his campaign on his legitimate opposition from the ballot, but on the nascent Islamic movement of Uzbekistan developing in Namangan, which Karimov saw as a far bigger threat to his power. During this campaign trip, meant to promise to improve things as long as the locals toned down the Islamist stuff, everything went wrongly. Tahir Yuldashev and his colleague with whom he had founded the Islamic movement had Islam Karimov kneel down in public and pledge to create an Islamic state in Uzbekistan. Being surrounded by what amounted to an angry mob, Karimov did oblige the request and made a promise that he had no intent of ever keeping and would in fact form the face of his regime for the next 25 years. Following his victory in the election, Islam Karimov spent no time in starting to enact revenge upon those who had humiliated him. Yuldashev and Zhumaboy Ahmadjonovich Hodjiev, later known as Zhuma Namangani, the two figureheads of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, were soon forced into exile as the Karimov regime organized a very thorough and violent crackdown on the movement. These two regrouped in Tajikistan just as the civil war was ramping up there. But that's a story for episode 14. For the purposes of this episode, I should say that the humiliation that Karimov was subjected to by Yuldashev and Zhumana Mangani paved the way to many of the geopolitical decisions he would make at the turn of the century. Namangani died in Afghanistan in 2001 following intelligence provided to the United States by the Karimov regime. Tahir Yuldashev died following a drone strike in Pakistan, also with the help of intelligence provided by Karimov's SGB. Karimov also took vengeance on his legitimate opposition as well. Muhammad Salih was forced into exile and to this day lives in Norway, and his brother, Uzbek dissident Muhammad Bekjanov, former editor of the opposition newspaper Erk, was incarcerated in 1999 on trumped-up charges and kept in prison under solitary confinement and physical torture for the next 18 years. He was released a few months after Islam Karimov's death. Now, why did Islam Karimov hold such a grudge? Well, in addition to his personal disdain for Islamism, his unstoppable lust for absolute power, and being very upset that he was personally humiliated in 1991, there were also regional politics reasons as well. You see, in 1992, Tajikistan was bracing for a civil war which was going to last for 5 years, displace millions, and be a source of violence for all countries around it, including Uzbekistan. In that war, on the side of the anti-state Islamist-inspired rebels fought Yuldashev and Namangani and plenty of other people like them who also had as a personal objective to take down Karimov's regime. The West learned about Islamist terrorism in September 2001, but here, in Uzbekistan, this had been a threat for decades before, which is why, at first, the Uzbeks did support the Soviet-Afghan war. And it's also why Karimov's policies on Islamism were widely popular in the 1990s and all the way till the mid-2000s, in fact. For us in the West, boiling people alive, mass arrests, drone strikes in neighboring countries on political dissidents, physical surveillance via checkpoints around all mosques, and strict state control over all mosques, these are all at the very least controversial policies, if not outright unacceptable. But in the 1990s in Uzbekistan this was popular. Yes, Karimov made the decisions in dictatorial ways, but that didn't change the fact that the policies were popular. The Uzbeks were seeing the flow of refugees from Tajikistan, the people in Namangan were still grappling with some violence for several years after the Islamists had been exiled, arrested or killed, and as years were going by, the standard of living in Uzbekistan started to slowly go up. Yes, a lot slower than it should have gone, but at least it wasn't endlessly collapsing like in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. And for the Uzbek people, that was more important than the abstract ideals of democracy and rule of law. Those ideas require a full stomach and bullets not flying around from random religious zealots. It sounds terrible when you put it in these terms, but that's really how things work most of the time. The relationship between Islom Karimov and his subjects, and I use this terminology because that's really how the system worked, like an absolutist monarchy. So, the relationship between Karimov and his subjects started to turn sour after the year 2000. You see, he was supposed to step down in the year 2000 according to the constitution. So, he pulled the Putin and amended the constitution to allow him to run again, and then did the same in 2007 and again in 2015. At one point, I was in Bukhara, and the hotel manager, who had worked in Poland and Czechia before returning home, asked me whether Romania was a democracy. And I was like, well, it depends on what you mean by democracy. Generally, yes, although there are problems, abuses by politicians. And he cut me short with the line, listen, does the president leave office when completing 2 terms? And I was like, yes, of course. And sometimes the incumbent loses re-election too, and of course also leaves office if that happens. To which he replies, well, then it's a democracy. Here, they amend the constitution as many times as needed to keep the same Chelovek in power. I was going to find out later on that that's the standard introduction to political conversations with foreigners, in the few cases when you encounter a local willing to even discuss politics. From an Uzbek perspective, the president losing re-election, or at least leaving after 2 terms, would be a positive step forward. But more on that in the next episode when we go through the reforms. Back to Karimov, in the mid-2000s, the regime got more harsher as the legitimacy and, well, consent of the governed wasn't there anymore. While in the 1990s the populace had appreciated Karimov's isolationism due to the multiple problems in the neighboring countries, particularly Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and general suspicion of Russia's post-colonial ambitions, by mid-2000s the same policy was no longer sitting well with the Uzbek people. The civil war in Tajikistan had ended, the situation in Afghanistan had been stabilized, yes, by the United States with explicit Uzbek help, and everyone in the region except Turkmenistan was opening up. By 2005, Uzbekistan was officially a key strategic ally of the United States in the war on terror. An American military base had been opened here, and more people were hoping that this will come with some freedoms too, as it did in other places, but the Karimov regime was in no mood for change. Because, like it usually happens with absolute power, even though the immediate threats to his regime were long in the past, Karimov thought that any change would bring war in the country. So, in May 2005, protests erupted in Andijan by means of civil disobedience and non-violent resistance. The regime's response was brutal and not fully explained to this day. Officially, 187 people were killed in what is now known as the Andijan massacre. A defector from the SGB secret police said that at least 1,500 people were killed. Thousands were arrested and tens of thousands ended up living in refugee camps in neighboring Kyrgyzstan. After many years of troubles, the imperfect, always unstable democracy of Kyrgyzstan was now indeed safer than the safe and stable dictatorship of Karimov. These images, filmed in secret by a highly courageous film crew that reached Andijan illegally through Kyrgyzstan just after the massacre, they show just a tiny glimpse of just how closed off the Uzbek society really was. I hope Journeyman Pictures won't copyright strike me for these few seconds, but it's important to show this. Quite a few people preferred to live in a tent in the middle of nowhere in Kyrgyzstan than to stick around for much longer under the increasingly repressive regime of Islom Karimov. The aftermath of the Andijan massacre was quite predictable. The regime blamed Islamists for it, the USA criticized the use of excessive force, and in return the US military base was shut down, and the regime tightened the already tight restrictions on religious life by banning the Muslim call to prayer entirely, and also ending the construction of mosques altogether, which were already nearly impossible to build to begin with, following the 1999 rules introduced after an assassination attempt on Karimov. By 2006, it was obvious even in public just how schizophrenic the regime had become. So while nearly all public expressions of religious sentiment were now a jailable offense, the dear leader was professing the Islamic declaration of faith in public. Here he is, courtesy of the YouTube channel named after the former president, which has been uploading footage of Karimov daily for the last 4 years.
La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah degende
Now, I called Karimov earlier the dear leader, and the reason I did so was not to be edgy and make another DPRK comparison, but because that is really how this worked. After 2017, the post-Karimov regime has been busy shutting down museums in the honor of the dear leader, making sure everyone knows that it's really okay to have a public-facing business that doesn't feature the portrait of the president, and of course, taking down the multiple statues of Islom Karimov. So by 2022, when I got to Uzbekistan, it was harder to gather evidence of the personality cult, but even so, quite a few are still standing. The Islam Karimov Museum was shut down weeks before I got here without any official announcement. The guards of this complex, locally known as the White House, informed me that the museum is not under renovation but has been permanently shut down, and they're there merely to prevent further vandalism. Before 2017, though, this place was a key stop in all organized tours. No tourist organized tour was permitted to take place in the country without a stop here. That's how, to this day, you find Karimov propaganda on all of the Western travel guides and websites, as those who write them routinely did not know better, though some of them were corrupted, to be sure. And one of the reasons few knew better is due to the fact that after the year 2000, Islom Karimov effectively killed any semblance of media freedom. In the 1990s, the media space in the country was quite open, including for foreign publications, and pluralistic-ish, with less freedom awarded to domestic publications. But after the year 2000 and until 2017, several months after his death, the state owned almost all media, and the State Control Inspectorate, located in Tashkent, secured tight editorial control. Topics deemed sensitive were not considered for publishing, and a ban was in place to prevent publications from publishing anything, especially if they gave space to unregistered opinions. Arrests of journalists have also been documented all over the country, so in practicality, anything getting closer to reality had to be published abroad, which is why so many of the news dispatches from the Karimov era were released from Almaty or Bishkek. This is also why footage like this one from 2015 looks and feels as if it's from the late 1980s. When the internet came around, the state established a unique state server which would act as both an internet service provider and an effective censor. Anything not explicitly approved would not be served to customers, which in reality rendered the Uzbek internet unusable until 2016. This also meant generalized technological backwardness in almost all areas. Even so, by 2014, students in particular were finding ways to use the internet to oppose the regime. And arguably, the abolition of slavery in 2022 started on the Uzbek internet in 2014, though, of course, it's a bit more complicated than that. So how was it like to live under Karimov? Well, in addition to very slow economic development and very low crime rate after the year 2000, living under Karimov was quite harsh if one wasn't a low-tier peasant, basically. If you were a state employee, you could expect to win the slavery lottery. I'm not even joking. Every year, the state would compel various state employees to pick cotton when harvesting season would come. Millions of people every year were drafted into this system. First, the state employees, then university students, then high school students. After the year 2000, plenty of children too. Things had gotten so bad that in 2009 an international boycott was launched, and unlike other similar campaigns, this one actually worked. Although it worked because Islam Karimov died in 2016 and the subsequent administration was far more open to working with activists and pass reforms and allow independent oversight to eliminate forced labor and reduced harm. All of that wealth was going to Islam Karimov and his friends. The first family was, and still is, very wealthy. Same goes for the inner circle of power, including the current president who, although is overseeing genuinely transformative reforms, it should not be forgotten that he hails from the same Samarqand clan as Karimov. Okay, so what if you weren't a state employee? Well, the chance of being drafted to pick cotton for the dear leader was far lower if you weren't involved with a state institution. But then what to do? Well, whatever you wanted to do, if it involved walking down the streets of a big city, it meant intrusive and repeated searches and checkpoints. The cities were more or less open-air prisons. Some vestiges of that are still visible today, though they are being removed quite fast. Still, notice the hard wall in the middle of the road? Well, in Karimov's time, crossing the street required permission from the checkpoint, and there was physically no way of crossing anywhere else. You would have to justify it to a random officer. Sure, in practice it wasn't always so rigidly enforced, but in theory, the movement of people, even on foot within a city, was tightly regulated. Also, some cities were not accessible to locals the easy way, that is to say by car, plane or train. The city of Bukhara, for instance, had the railway station behind huge fences and was intentionally moved way outside the city, and this road from the railway station into the city went through several localities which officially didn't exist. Today, the access is normal and free, but in 2015 you would have to require permission to get into Bukhara by train, and permission would rarely be granted to locals, though it was permitted for tourists. Limiting or regulating the movement of people was done at an infrastructure level. Nearly everything built during Karimov in terms of infrastructure was built with a view to limit freedom. Where that wasn't possible, physical checkpoints and surveillance towers were employed. Reminiscent of that era are the security guards at the metro stations and other places. Officially, they're supposed to check everyone's bags. Twice, because there's 2 checkpoints at every metro station. In practice, it's all a theater now, and they know it too. After several attempts at starting a conversation, eventually one of the security guards opened up a little bit after he made sure I'm not recording. Cigarettes do wonders everywhere. From what I gathered, the current regime is trying to fire as many of these guards as possible without causing a riot. The officer who spoke to me was hoping to be promoted as he spoke Chinese and Tajik, but he contended 2/3 of the colleagues in his unit will be jobless by the end of 2023. These green shirts were the backbone of the surveillance apparatus back in Karimov's time. Today, they're a relic, an anachronism waiting to be dealt with. Anyway, if you somehow manage to cope with all of this and end up starting a business, then you'd better pray someone connected to the dear leader doesn't want your business. A business owner in Samarkand explained it to me with documents how a hotel or a store could simply be seized from you and transferred to someone else. This was done especially if a relative from the local SGB chief wanted your spot. Taxes were officially low, lower than they are today in fact, but in practice, in addition to official taxes, you'd also have to pay bribes for anything, including for being allowed to exist. A random officer would just show up and simply ask for money, just because he could. There was nowhere to complain anyway, so in practice the fiscal burden was quite higher than it is today. And if you refused too vigorously, your business could be shut down and you'd end up arrested on charges of illegally owning foreign currency, which would have likely been a true charge because you couldn't do business without owning foreign currency, especially US dollars, even if it was illegal. Nobody outside Uzbekistan accepts the local sumu to this day. It's not convertible at all, but today you can buy dollars legally. During Karimov's time, you'd have to rely on the black market, which, although tolerated, carried some risks, especially if you held politically incorrect opinions. And that wasn't hard at all. Just being Muslim could be enough. Tens of thousands of people have been persecuted under charges of Wahhabism for having said or advocated things that didn't even have anything to do with religion in the first place. So what if you wanted to leave? Well, that was permitted. The problem was being able to afford it. Again, the local currency is not convertible anywhere, and owning US dollars was forbidden. It was a matter of routine to have one's dollars confiscated at the border. In fact, to this day, the checks at the border are harsher on the exit than upon entering the country. When I entered Uzbekistan, the security control took 3 minutes. When I exited, it took 20 minutes. When I complained about that, the locals told me that this is great improvement. Back in Karimov's time, exiting the country could take as long as 4 hours. And finally, if you didn't have business acumen and stomach for the corruption, you didn't want to leave the country, nor you didn't want to be a state worker, the only other options were to work the fields, which was low pay but also very low state interference as long as you weren't doing cotton, or to try to get one of the few coveted jobs in one of the few quasi-private factories where the pay was good, but the competition was crushing. Today, working in an industry is far more common and the pay even better now, and now business competes for workers as they should, but back in Karimov's time, this wasn't the case. And one of the reasons was Karimov's isolationist policy. Okay, Uzbekistan under Karimov wasn't exactly the mother of all neutrality like Turkmenistan, but quite similar. After the Andijan massacre in 2005, the distrust in foreign relations became a two-way street. The Европейский Союз imposed sanctions and demanded a full investigation on the human rights record of the country. Even Putinist Russia briefly imposed a few sanctions due to the excessively cruel behavior by the authorities against Russian media and Russian journalists. China remained mostly uninterested in Uzbekistan during the time of Hu Jintao and the first term of Xi Jinping, so for all intents and purposes, the country remained isolated politically and economically for the last decade of Karimov's rule. Some of those sanctions remained in place even after Karimov's death, although now, almost 7 years after his death, things are back to a sort of normal. And it shows. The level of prosperity you can see in my footage is almost a different country than what you can find in footage from 10 years ago. The biggest problem was the information gap. People in the cities knew things could be better but didn't know how to articulate it, and when they tried, they got arrested or shot. And people in the villages knew things could be better but oftentimes weren't even allowed in the cities to articulate it. Besides, with the state owning nearly all media, all everyone saw was praise for the dear leader on TV and in all newspapers, in 360p resolution. A young chap in Tashkent, trying to practice his English, told me that's how he knew something was clearly wrong. He was watching English and Russian language vloggers from Kazakhstan, Russia or Europe and noticed that even regular guys from their bedroom could afford to broadcast in a better video quality than state TV. That prompted him to wonder whether there are things the state is hiding from him, such as, incompetence, bankruptcy or corruption. One internet search led to another, and I nearly got arrested. Thank God he died while I was investigated, he told me. But before we get to Karimov's death, here's footage from his 2015 re-election party. In March 2015, Islom Karimov was re-elected one more time in a one more sham election in which the nominal opposition candidates openly announced that they had voted for Islam Karimov. It was all a clown show. And after the clown show of the election, it followed the circus. A stadium-held celebration in his honor, North Korea style. But the show was already over. Even in this propaganda footage, it was clear that he was weakened. If he hadn't died the next year, we would have probably witnessed yet another bloodshed by 2020. This is now the view of even some of his honest supporters. For all intents and purposes, Islom Karimov died just in time. He remained in power enough to enrich his family for the next 5 generations, but died just before the whole thing would collapse under its own weight, leaving the task of fixing the multifaceted and multi-layered issues of the regime to this guy, Shavkat Mirziyoyev. Mr. Mirziyoyev, prime minister at the time of Karimov's death, turned out to be quite able at political maneuvering and secured his place as successor in a surprisingly peaceful manner, comparatively speaking, for the standards of the region. Now, while the Mirziyoyev era is the topic of the next episode, I will say now that the successor tried, and so far somewhat succeeded, to transition away from the dictatorial model at a pace and speed as close as possible to what the societal standard permits, while balancing the geopolitics of the region and other security concerns. So, the restrictions on freedom of movement went away almost the next day, initially under the excuse that people need to be allowed to mourn the death of the dear leader, and then made permanent unceremoniously a few months later. The restrictions on religious life went away a few months later as well. So did the economic restrictions on individuals and small businesses. The last Karimov circus took place with the occasion of his funeral. It looked like you would expect. Spectacular cries in the streets, long columns, and the burial in this mammoth mausoleum built in Samarqand specifically for this purpose. The site was still open for visitation as of August 2022, but there are rumors that it will be eventually closed as part of the gradual effort to phase out the Islom Karimov personality cult. The aftermath of 27 years of Islam Karimov is a complicated mess in its own right, as he not only ruled in an autocratic manner, but also in an idiosyncratic manner. The international relations of Uzbekistan should be a subject of study in any respectable school. I mean, here's Islam Karimov lecturing Putin and Lukashenko in Moscow about what a bad idea it is to get involved militarily in Ukraine. At the same time, this same man complained about the US while housing US military bases. Then expelled the United States because they told him it's not a good look to kill over 1,000 of your civilian population because they protested, all while he imprisoned even some of his advisors for daring to point out to him that CCP subversion was on the rise in the country. Even so, he didn't seek closer cooperation with the CCP either. For a place with such a complicated geography, Islam Karimov was able to get away with so much strategic ambiguity for decades, and that in itself is remarkable. Now, don't get me wrong, it's remarkable because it's relatively rare, not because it's a good thing. Karimov's insistence on perpetual strategic ambiguity sacrificed the liberty and prosperity of an entire generation of Uzbek youth. The first post-communist generation, now in its 40s, is only now experiencing what they really deserved almost 20 years ago. Now, that's not to say that the current status quo is perfect or even very good, and we'll have an entire episode to explain that, but it is to say that things have visibly improved in almost all respects following the death of Islam Karimov, regardless of what regime apparatchiks, nostalgics, and yes, they have those too, or the controlled media have to say. The death of Karimov provided an opportunity for a peaceful transition of power to a different way of doing things. Some of those have become apparent already in the 7 years that have gone by since that funeral, but what's in the bag politically and geopolitically? The context has changed quite a bit, and the new leader's term expires in 2026. In fact, 2026 is allegedly the first democratic test. Maybe. But that's a story for the next episode. Until then, there's one more thing that needs to be said. Islam Karimov was a sort of a jolly joker on international relations. He refused autarky and complete neutrality, but he also refused geopolitical alignment. He defied Russia when nobody expected him to, walked in lockstep with Russia when nobody expected him to, ended up being sanctioned by both Russia and the West after collaborating militarily with both, and all without triggering a war, and in fact preventing one. From this perspective, Karimov was indeed a wild card. Too bad that living under his rule was a nightmare. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous financial support. Don't forget to subscribe, visit our website, and consider financially backing the next series. And with that, I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.